mix to make one move, and then you're just really scared that you're not going to screw something else up. You know, like the bass tone's going to change and you didn't notice it. And people like Bob Clearmountain, who, you know, one of the greatest mixers out there, Ryan Freeland, who was a guy that was at Chico State, he was Bob's assistant for many years, and Ryan's job was basically to go through the console and write every single setting of every knob, and then go through all the compressors, and it would take him about 2 hours to set up and recall a mix. But, you know, Bruce wants to come back in and remix that Woodstock track, you know, that kind of stuff. So it's got to be perfect.
Yeah.
But now it's almost laughable that the amount of documentation, and these engineers now are like, I'm just throwing that stuff out, all that documentation.
Yeah, the box. There is one thing on that note too, is that if it's just the vocal, like these guys just ran into that, their mix was a little hot on the vocal, and so my suggestion was give them a vocal up and a vocal down mix.
Absolutely.
So that the artist can pick.
If you're delivering stuff to a record company, it's a good time. That's a good option to have a vocal up and a vocal down. I did an album, and we were sending it to Bernie Drummond and mastered, which is he's $450 an hour, and I was pretty sure I'd lived with these mixes for a long time that they were good to go. But I thought, man, you know, I'm $35 an hour, and I can run vocal ups because everything's in the box. In about an hour, I can do the whole album vocal up. So I did the whole album with a vocal up, and sure enough, we got to like track 8, and Bernie's like, God, I wish I had just a little more vocal on this one. It's like, oh, okay, let's put it in. And sometimes it's more of an East Coast thing, but mixing in stems, where they'll do a stereo bus pair of the instruments, maybe with the bass, maybe without the drums, maybe the bass separate or included with the drums for the instrument, and the vocals. Then you can recombine those stems later. But the problem is, you don't want to give the mastering engineer like mixing responsibility. That's just, you're leaving it too open-ended. You know, we have so many opportunities to keep changing stuff, and nobody commits to decisions. So I'm not a huge fan of stems, but now this is kind of interesting. You got people that are taking their project and they're going out of the box to a studio with like a Neve console, and they're in the studio for one day. They're paying the day rate. They'll do the mix. They've already done the mix, and then they're just passing it through this console, almost static. They're not really riding it. And then, because they're not going to be in the studio again, that's a good example of a time when you could print the stems with all that beautiful coloration that the board has imparted, and then you could recall it later without having to go back to the studio and pay for another day. But I tell you what, when I track, I'm tracking the band through my console. It's an AMEC, a large format console. And then as soon as I do a playback through the stereo bus of Pro Tools, something is gone. And it's never coming back, and I'm going to spend a lot of hours trying to make it sound like how I just heard it when it was tracking, which was basically completely analog. I'm hearing it through the converters, but they're just passing it analog. So in the box, you lose some stuff. So you have to kind of make that up. But the trade-off is so much that even the biggest cats in the world now are pretty much staying in the box, unless you're like Michael Brower, who's, you know, doing Coldplay, and it's all based on this sonic dirtiness that's going on there, and he just works on one track at a time, and the budgets are insane, and he's got lots of assistants. So most of the time we're not going to go in the box, but or out of the box.
There's a mix review in, I think it's Sound on Sound or something, where the guy that just mixed the new Evanescence record took him 2 Pro Tools rigs, 2 full maxed out Pro Tools rigs, and busted out to the console, and he had the whole console just loaded with tracks. I mean, there was just ridiculous amount of tracks on there. He did the whole mix on the console. And he primarily used just console EQ and compression.
He used like 150 tracks or something on that sound.
Yeah, and what's neat about that now is you can, I've done that sort of hybrid setup for a long time. I use Pro Tools and I do all my, or pick the DAW, and I do all my automation in the box, but then I just run back through the console for the sonic signature that it imparts. And when you say it sounds better, or people say it sounds better if you're switching around on Gear Sluts or Tape Op or wherever, there's a coloration in there that's happening that they like, but it's not necessarily cleaner or more accurate. And there's so many in-the-box, out-of-the-box arguments. They're starting to kind of dwindle now because people are doing amazing stuff like Dave Pensato, it's in the box. It's incredible sounding. One thing I heard that was really recently that tried to break it down was this guy's doing these real tight A-B comparisons, was that the bass isn't as good, and so they'd say, well, the vocals, the clarity on the top end of my mix isn't quite as good in the box, but I'm losing something running through the console, and this is through a $100,000 SSL. And what they came up with was that the power supply of the console can't handle the big bass, and it creates a power surge in the console, and so your bass isn't as tight. And that's exactly what's happening in my console. I have way better audio quality for the highs and mids, and the lows aren't quite there. And then I bypass it and go straight through the box to the speakers, and the bass is so much better. So, and of course, everything has a lot more low end in it now, so that's a huge advantage. Then there's the third type of mixing that's kind of in between the two is summing, and that's where you take your outputs of your converter, like you take everything out channel by channel. You may have to pair up a few things depending on how many converters you have, and then you run it, instead of through a console, you run it through a summing amplifier, which a lot of times is just a combining box with no electronics in it, maybe a few resistors, and then you just combine everything in there, so you're doing all your mixing in the computer, runs through this box, and then there's a makeup gain stage, which it goes back through a microphone preamp, because the way the gain staging is, basically one of your mic pre's becomes the output, becomes the main fader of your mixer to make up the gain loss of combining everything. And it's really cool because you can use, if you have 3 or 4 different flavored preamps, I can try it through my tube preamps, I can try it through my John Hardy, which is like the API or the Day King, and find one that sounds different. So you're definitely imparting a sonic signature through the makeup gain on that. And I found that most of the time the trade-off is not worth it. I've done a couple jazz records with it, and it was really great, and I liked it. But again, you still have to set and note where your preamp settings are. So it's just another way to go. You can build one of these boxes for about $50. I built one. And then there's a bunch out there, the Fulcrum, and which is passive. There's now companies making units with the makeup gain built in, like Dangerous is one of the most popular ones, the Dangerous 2-bus, which I would love to have something like that, but I can't justify it. $500 for something when in the box is so stinking close. So the way I do it nowadays is I'm in the box, and then I run out to my best converters that I have for the output, which is the Apogee. And then, because when you bring the master volume down in the computer, you're lowering your bit depth. So to control the volume, I have a passive volume knob that I paid this guy in Australia $300 to make. So I'm always running the mix full volume out of the master 2-track out. And then if I want to turn the volume down in the studio, I use this thing. So I'm always getting the full bit depth. And then
Cover that again, because that's important. When you bring the stereo bus down from the DAW, then you lose
if you bring, if you're at, so you got like maybe 105 dB range on your output of your DAW. If you're down, if your output is, let's just say 57 and a half, it's halfway down, you're down to 16 bits. If you get down below that, you're down to 12 bits. So you lose resolution as the volume is quieter. In the old days, you would incur more hiss from the analog electronics, so we kept our levels hot to minimize the hiss. Now we need to keep our levels hot for a different set of reasons, which is basically that you'll lose bit depth. And that's why, like with recording the girl's vocal, doing a little bit of compression on the way in keeps that level nice and hot. And so long as you don't do compression that's affecting it in a way that is going to tie your hands later. So it's really important to keep your levels as hot as possible without going nuts over it. But when you're playing back and you want to turn it down in the studio, like here you guys have the gain knob, so that's
just for our
that's just for the bass.
Blue Sky
That's just for
monitors.
those. Basically, yeah. So if you're monitoring through the console and you bring it down here, you're changing the way that the mix sounds, the depth. Some of the reverb's tails are gonna drop off some of the stuff in the back of the mix. So it's just something that's good to know. I mean, I worked years without it, and it's no big deal. But when you start splitting hairs about how can I make it just a little bit better, how can I make my listening experience and my rig sound better, because I was just using the output of the Digio 2, which sounds good, but then it's like, man, I have these apogees sitting here, I'm not using them. Why don't I route the apogee, but then it's going to be full volume, so then I brought this knob thing this guy made.
So you run it back through a converter out of the box through the converter to do the final mix.
The final mix is so I'll take it's just a bus, 15 and 16 is what I like to use. I call it the print bus, and then I run that through a mastering compressor or whatever I'm going to put on there, maybe a little more EQ. Sometimes the mastering compressor is just so that the artist can hear it kind of how it's going to be, and then if I'm going to send it to somebody else to master, I can take that off. And, a lot of these engineers, like Ed Cherney's, like, I used to deliver stuff unmastered for them to listen, and then some hotshot comes in and just throws an L2 compressor on there. His mix sounds bigger to the record company, he loses the gig. So it's really important. So you need to deliver it. And for a long time, because I was old school, I was like, well, we're going to get that level up there at the last step, so don't worry about it being low. And people would be like, yo, this sounds low. Well, it's no big deal. Throw the plug-in in there, get the level up there. That's kind of how it's going to sound. And then you can futz around with that later.
I use the
We're all
L2 a
used to
lot.
stuff pretty loud now. Especially if you put it in your iPod, comparing to other stuff. So yeah, summing is sort of, you'll see a lot of people talking about it. It's just another way to go. Like I said, I built the box and I don't really hardly use it. I'm not doing too much out of the box. The other thing that a lot of these guys do is they may have one or two things that their studio pieces of hardware that sound really good that they like that they can't do in the box, like an Eventide Orville or Vercasti reverb, or you might have some old, I have an Ibanez delay I bought in 1982 that I just love the sound of it, and so if I really wanted that instead of the built-in delay, I could run that out on a aux end or whatever on a bus. Just take it to an AD out. Take the output of the AD, run it to the piece, and then run it back in, and then re-record it or just have it on the insert playing back. And you have to usually, in almost every DAW, you're going to have to delay that track earlier to make up for the time it takes to convert it out, go through the thingy, and come back in. Basically, the converter has a little delay, 3 milliseconds or something. And there's ways to test that. You can duplicate the track and then re-record it back in. You can actually see the spikes and how far off they are, and then just nudge it over until it's lined up. So, again, these are just techniques you should be aware of. You'll see a lot of hot topic arguments and gear sluts about that stuff. So that's kind of where it's going, but it's pretty much we're probably here to stay in the box, and I love it. It's drums first, but we're kind of getting back into an era of lo-fi drums again, so the drums don't have to be so big. So usually I just listen through and just kind of hear how it